Good evening, welcome to ITV News in Wales. On the programme tonight, marking 100 years since Britain's worst mining disaster, the community of Senghenydd comes together to remember the lives of 439 miners and those who died in tragedies across Wales. Tragedies that affected thousands of families. We take a look at the lasting impact on the mining industry. Good evening from Senghenydd. It was here 100 years ago that 439 miners went to work and never came home. They were killed in an explosion at Universal Colliery. It was the UK's worst mining disaster. Today, this small town came together to remember those who lost their lives and, of course, the families that they left behind. A monument behind me was unveiled to mark the anniversary of the disaster and, of course, other tragedies right across Wales. Our correspondent, Carol Green, has the story of today's events.
At precisely 8:10, 6 blasts from the Universal Colliery hooter pierced the morning quiet along the Aber Valley, just as it did 100 years ago, alerting this community to the deadly explosion at the mine. The blast and the fire which followed claimed the lives of 439 miners and 1 rescuer. It was called a terrible calamity at the time. It's still Britain's worst mining disaster. Today, the community came out to mock the centenary and remember. At the high school, pupils, many the same age as the youngest casualties, who were just 14, form the number 439, and a black balloon was released for every miner lost. Then a dedication service for the memorial garden and bronze statue. It shows a rescuer helping one of the survivors.
Here is mayhem on a catastrophic level. And if you look at the houses behind us there, High Street there lost 35 men. There are houses you can see in the 4 terraces that lost 56 men. Commercial Street lost 45 men. And there's these personal tales.
And personal tributes from the descendants of the dead who came to pay their respects at the memorial wall.
I'm remembering my great-grandfather, William Morgan, and his 2 sons. That's William, aged 20, and Ernest, aged 17. The husband and 2 sons all perished in the explosion. And a day later, Trevor was brought to the surface alive.
205 women were widowed. The price of a miner's life in compensation, 1 shilling and a penny and 1 load of coal. Hilary Barbrook lost both grandfathers and saw the impact on those left behind.
My grandmother, James, I think it would have been a lot, because she had 8 children and she was pregnant. She was 8 months pregnant when my grandfather died, and he was the breadwinner.
This tower remembers David Evans, aged 51, from Park Terrace, and just below Evan Evans, aged 22. Like so many in this community in this disaster, fathers and sons who lived, worked and died together.
At 8:10 that day, on that morning in October.
100 years on, even the youngest members of this community were moved by the stories and the scale of the disaster.
I feel really emotional, and I feel that the valley have lost so many people because of the explosion.
This valley has moved on from coal, but as the community looks to its future, it's also determined not to forget its past. Carol Green, ITV News, Senghenydd.
Well, I'm really pleased to say I'm joined by a gentleman who probably needs no introduction, certainly to the people who are here. Tyrone O'Sullivan, welcome this evening. I think your name, your face, almost synonymous with mining today, and yet here we are on such a momentous and an emotional day, isn't it?
It's incredible for me, because 2 of the pavings I can directly relate to. The Mardy one, 1885, 81 killed. There was my great-grandfather and his 2 sons. Christmas Eve, and they don't come home. And my grandfather, years later, would never allow me to plan. He'd say, "Don't plan, boy, don't plan." only because he was 70 years of age, but it still affected him about his dad and two brothers being killed.
So clearly you've got family connections, but at the memorial behind our shoulders is to those miners who've lost life right across Wales, not just here in Senghenydd, as indeed you lost your family. Who'd have thought that, you know, these accidents are still happening in this very day and age?
Well, just remember one thing. After that, my father got killed in Caerphilly, 1963, 50 years ago. So every part of my family had an impact. But in the world today, people are still being slaughtered. That's the tragedy, that people are still being slaughtered out there. But remember, when you're 2.5 miles underground, that's the way it is.
Is it just that we're not learning lessons from these tragedies, Tyrone?
Do anybody learn lessons where profits are concerned? Where energy is concerned? Because remember, energy runs the world. And we were at our industrial revolution. We changed the world. Now there's other countries out there trying to do the same for their people, and they need energy. And the tragedy is the energy we're talking about is 2.5 or 3 miles underground. And we've got no control over that.
And yet, I suppose, as much of a tragedy as events like this actually are, mining is still very much part of what makes us who we are and what makes us Welsh.
I know, I've never found a person who didn't want to be a coal miner. Once you've tasted it and felt the power of it, because you feel like a man to all men, you know. You're down there, you're fighting, you're battling every day. So it gives you something very special. And remember, when you get hurt down there, there's no doctor.
Yeah.
He's 2.5 miles away, at least 2.5 hours. We look after our own, and that gives you something special.
Tyrone, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us this evening. Well, of course, the focus today may have been on the explosion here at the Universal Colliery site in 1913, but the path surrounding the memorial statue marks other mining disasters which have devastated communities right across Wales. Megan Boot now has been looking at some of the personal stories behind some of those tragedies.
Machinery that marked landscapes, digging for the black gold beneath.
More often today, mining is seen as a museum piece, part of our heritage that fueled the Industrial Revolution and brought jobs to our valleys. But it has a living legacy, and those disasters being marked today didn't just take away lives. For those that remained, they defined them.
Although there was some local government support, many widows had to rely on taking in washing, sewing and ironing to make ends meet, the bereaved becoming the breadwinners.
What's there to look forward to? Money doesn't mean a thing to me. My husband's health and his body was more to me than any money. There's no money can bring him back. But if you saw his body, you'd realise what I am trying to put home is all right for these people to see the men dressed walking out. Strip them. And then look at them, and then tell me the price of coal, and is it worth it?
But people went back. The first day of work after the Cambrian colliery disaster of 1965 left more than 30 dead.
But this morning, only 80 out of 300 men turned up, ready to go underground again.
Returning despite the dangers.
Well, there's two things here. Firstly, economic necessity and the lack of alternative employment that would be available. The second, though, there is a community of miners, a community of colliers. And throughout the time when the coal industry is under threat, of course, in more recent history, you know, that theme has come right through.
It's a community that spans generations. Albert was just 14 when he worked in the Gresford colliery along with his father.
Well, he worked regular nights. You know, the only time I was with him going to work would be when he was on nights. We just cycled together.
That would be the last time Albert spoke to him. He was one of the 266 men who died from the explosion at Gresford near Wrexham in 1934.
We knew it was terrible down below. Oh, everybody said those had to come out even. They were shocked. They were like frightened men, really. It was so bad. And it was just, everybody knew nobody could be alive behind that wall of flame there and all.
But as the century progressed, explosions continued. In 1960, 45 men died in the Six Bells mining tragedy, including twin brothers Bill and Mansell Reynolds. But the turn of the century didn't mark the end of death in the mines. 4 died in Glacian barely 2 years ago. Today, then, sees a public marking of the very personal price Wales has paid for coal. Megan Boot, ITV News.
Well, one lady, Jill Jones, was part of the group that got the monument here today. Jill, we've been hearing tales of tragedies, the 439 boys, men who lost their lives here, and other tragedies across the country. But of course, women were involved. They were here on the day, weren't they? How were they affected?
Well, you must remember that there were 1,000 men working in the pit. The Hooters went, rushed to the pit to try and get some news because there was very little news unless they went to find out themselves, and there was the long wait. Because half the pit came up, so they went home and they thought the other half would soon follow, but nothing happened.
What must it have been like waiting at home for that news?
Well, most of them were waiting at the pit head, and I think that within a few hours that they realised it all was lost. That there wasn't any chance, no other man was coming out of their life.
I mean, we're talking about children, sons, grandsons, uncles lost here. How on earth did those women get through? How did they pull through it?
Well, I think of them all the time, and it must have been very, very difficult. I don't know whether I'd be strong enough to do it myself, but it must have been just horrendous. I mean, to have a family life and then nothing. I mean, some lost the husband and three sons, 4 from one house. Awful.
And yet those communities got through it. Senghenydd got through it, as have other communities. Next generations are still here. So somehow they did it, didn't they? They found that strength.
Well, yes, but I think it took a long time before they had closure. And, it's very, very difficult, very hard, because the widows were fortunate in a way that they did have some money. Money was paid to them immediately from the Lord Mayor's fund, albeit a small amount. But of course, before they could have the money, there was all these rules and regulations laid down by the trustees, all men, all men. And one of the rules was that they should remain chaste, and they would only have the money if they remained chaste.
Well, rules are rules, I suppose. But Jill, I suppose at least they had each other and they managed to get through it. Jill, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Thank you. Well, that is just about it from us here in Senghenydd for the moment. Coming up a little later in the programme, we'll be hearing the story of Bill Richards, who is at the scene of the Cambrian disaster, which killed more than 30 miners. For now, though, I'll hand you back to Jonathan Hill, who's in the studio for the rest of the day's news.
And that's it from me in the studio, but let's go back to that story now, and I'll hand you over to Ruth, who's at the Senghenydd Memorial for us tonight. Ruth.
John, thank you very much indeed. Well, the monument unveiled here today is to commemorate the 439 miners who lost their lives in the Senghenydd explosion 100 years ago. But of course, it's also dedicated to the many thousands more who've been touched by mining disasters. We've been hearing from Bill Richards, who helped raise the alarm at the Cambrian explosion in Caerphilly in 1965, which killed 30 men, of course. Using news footage from the time, this is Bill's story.
The explosion happened less than an hour before the morning shift was due to finish work. Though it was 870 feet below ground, the blast was heard for miles. Within minutes, police cars, ambulances and fire engines were on their way up the steep little street from Tonopandi to the Cambrian colliery at Clydach Vale.
Monday morning, May the 17th, 1965, was a Monday morning like any other, but eventually it turned out to be the worst morning in the history of Rhondda. At 10 to 11, I met Mr. Breeze, the manager. He was in his working clothes going to go down number 1 pit. And he stopped and he said to me, Bill, he said, I've got to go to P26. We've got electrical problems there. We haven't coaled properly all shift. 2.25 hours later, at 1 o'clock, or just after 1 o'clock, he and another 30 had gone, just like that.
As always, on these occasions, colliers from neighbouring pits volunteered immediately to go down to the rescue. Their search for their friends went on throughout the long wet afternoon and into the evening. There were 80 men underground in number 1 pit when the explosion came. No one knew how many had died or who they were.
I knew practically all of those boys, the 31 who died. Tommy Hahn was one. And that morning, he must have stripped about 5 yards from my locker. And poor old Tommy died that day. They were our friends. They were all special to us.
Just after 9 that night, the Rhondda knew the full extent of its latest pit tragedy. 31 dead, identified by the numbers on their lamps. Every man within an area of 350 yards of the blast had been killed, either by carbon monoxide poisoning or by multiple injuries.
There were a crowd of several hundred assembled there, and the police were stopping them coming across because obviously, grieving relatives there, and they could be a danger to themselves. And it is in the following days, on the Tuesday and other days, that you could see people coming to the colliery and you could see the grief on their faces.
Now the bereaved families wait for the funerals on Friday and Saturday. Families like that of Mr. Morgan, a retired collier whose son was killed on Monday.
Did you ever advise your sons not to go down and work in the mines?
I told them to get out of it altogether when the going was good. But he was talking about going out of it last week. But of course now it's too late.
I particularly remember the day of the funeral when we were walking from here to the cemetery in Triala. And we were walking, you could see ladies in their 70s standing at the roadside. And they had their grandkids with them, and plus a little boy, about 12 or 13. And the grandmother was putting her arm around him protectively, as if to say, "You won't go there, my boy." Well, as a memorial states, 31 boys lost their lives here in 1965, but we who survive will always remember them.
Well, that is it from us, from Senghenydd, on the day the community came together to commemorate all the miners who died in Wales, here at the site of the country's biggest disaster. The ITV News continues next with Alistair Stewart and Mary Nightingale, but from everyone here, I'll leave you now with some of the images of today and indeed from the past. The music for this piece, of course, composed by a miner to mark the Gresford disaster. From all of us here, very good evening to you.